Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
Namaskar. You have stepped into a course that is going to change the way that you look at data. Not just how you analyze it, but also how you communicate it. My name is Nivid Desai. I serve as the Program Executive at Writing Studio IIT Gandhinagar. Welcome to Writing for Data Science. This course is at the intersection of analysis and communication. As all of us know, data analysis is not just about coding and models. It is about solving real-world problems. And that is exactly why every single thought that goes into solving those problems needs to be communicated. And not just to one audience, across multiple stakeholders. That is where this course comes in. This course prepares you with the foundations of writing, especially curated for data science. We will discuss audience analysis, critical thinking, logical reasoning, as well as storytelling that is native to data science. So join me on a journey at the intersection of numbers and narratives. I'll see you in class. Namaste, hello and welcome to Writing for Data Science. My name is Nivid Desai and we are on a journey to explore the interesting intersections between numbers and narratives. So far, we have gone through the basics as well as some advanced components of storytelling in a general sense as well as storytelling within data. However, I would understand if all of this may seem a little overwhelming because intuitively we differentiate between numbers and narratives. That which is numerical, that which is statistical, may not always be narrative. So, once again, I must reiterate that I understand if this may be overwhelming. But that is what today's lecture is for. Today's lecture is about choosing the right data for the right story. In the midst of all of these conversations that we have been having, how do we know, how do we recognize what is the right data to use and what is the right story to tell? Today, we will break down some strategies and some characteristics of both what makes the right data and what makes the right story. As we understand, not all data belongs in every story. Depending on what the story is trying to say, we may need to curate the data insights to wrap them in the correct form of narrative. We will also need to augment them according to the audience and the purpose of that story. And that is why it is also important to understand that not every story works for every audience. You and I have gone through a lot of trouble to establish our understanding about audience analysis. That insight ties back in over here as well. Depending on what audience you are speaking to, you will need to know what story to tell. Every story, just because it is appealing, just because it is persuasive, may not work for every audience. Choosing the right data set or the right part of a data set can mean the difference between clarity and confusion or between action and inaction. We need our data to drive decisions. We need our data to influence impact. And in the midst of all of these clear purposes, if we mess up choosing the wrong data set or choosing the wrong part of a data set, it will end up affecting the way we tell our stories. Therefore, today's central focus is knowing what the right data is and what the right story is. Hold on, we will look at a lot of revision as far as the audience analysis chapter is concerned. We need to refresh our basics and connect them with our understanding of storytelling within data. Before we begin, let's quickly have a refreshing reflection. Think of a time when you heard someone quote a number, but it did not quite land. Was it too technical or too general? What would have helped? When somebody quotes a number, they expect to have a commanding authority on facts. But what if it does not land? What does not work in that kind of a scenario? Think about it. It will help you gain further clarity that quoting numbers may not always be enough due diligence in terms of a data story. You also need to tailor it with the right story. Now, I have been using the phrase the right data repeatedly so far. But a legitimate question to ask from our side would be, what exactly is the right data? How do we qualify if a point of data is right or not? That's a valid question. Let us try to see what makes the right data. First of all, as far as narrative storytelling is concerned, the first qualifier to make something the right data is relevance. Data should directly support the central claim or the question that a story is addressing. If you want to know whether your data is the right data in terms of relevance, ask a simple question. Does this data move the story forward? If it does not move the story forward, it may not be relevant for your narrative. Then, the second quality that must emphasize the rightness of data is clarity. Is it easy to explain or visualize? Can the audience interpret the data quickly? All of this will determine the clarity with which your audience will approach the data that you have catered. The third qualifying factor is scope and granularity. Granularity meaning breaking big data chunks into small granular modules essentially. So, how much are we covering? And how fine is the presentation of data? Avoid any data overload because the audience might have a cognitive overload. I hope that we remember that term from our previous lectures. The audience might go through a cognitive overload and they might stop paying attention. So, make your data appropriate in terms of its scope and granularity. Aggregate or disaggregate the data based on what helps the audience understand better. Because based on whether they will understand a huge chunk of data concentrated together or smaller chunks of data broken apart, you would be able to decide how to present the data, whether in an aggregate or disaggregate manner. How to make that decision? Also a valid question. I will come to that later in today's lecture itself. The fourth quality is trustworthiness. Source credibility and data freshness are critical. Where are you making the claim from? Is your evidence itself credible? Is the data latest? Is the data updated? all of this will define how trustworthy your own data is. And that is what will make it the right data. And in the end, I must also talk about the emotional resonance of data. This may not apply to all stories. This is only related to some data stories. But humanizing the data with case examples, with anecdotal evidence, or relatable framing can help connect with a broader audience. If you see, we have discussed these things about how to turn something into a strategic way of presenting data through setting and through context in the previous lecture. To heighten the emotional resonance of your story, this humanizing of data will prove to be extremely effective. So choose the data that you can humanize, that you can enhance for emotional resonance. So, all in all, to summarize my longish remarks, the first step in choosing the right data is understanding your intent of communication. Ask yourself, what story am I trying to tell? Are we clear about that first? Are we clear about the kind of story that we are telling? What insight or outcome do I want to highlight? And in the end, because all things boil down to recommendations and suggestions, what decision do I want to endorse or support? These factors will matter all in all in deciding what is the right data for your right story. Let's see an example to understand this better. Imagine that you are working on a report about electric vehicle EV adoption in India. If your story is about economic opportunity, you might highlight data on job creation in EV manufacturing hubs like Pune or Hosur. That is one angle of the data. That is one arc that the data story is presenting. If you remember, arc is about the emotional journey of a structure in storytelling. If your story is about public behavior, you might focus on charging infrastructure or adoption rates in tier 2 cities. That is one way of emphasizing the angle of public behavior in a story about EV. And if your story is about policy success, you might showcase state level subsidy impacts like Delhi's EV policy doubling sales in 2 years. This right here is a third different angle. The story continues to be about electric vehicles, mind you. The story continues to be about the focal subject, the focal problem or question at the heart of the story. But each different vantage point will end up defining the different kinds of data that you will use. That is exactly what I meant to say when I said relevance. The relevance of the data depends on what kind of story you are trying to say. If you choose data from the second story to fit the data from the first story, it will not move the story forward. It will in fact confuse your audience. That is why deciding the relevance factor of data is extremely crucial in making it the right data for your story. Each of these three different stories use different data slices from the same ecosystem, chosen to match the story's message. The story may have different messages to communicate, they may have different vantage points to talk about. The data collected will be a cluster, it will be an aggregated data. But you, my dear data communicator, will need to disaggregate the data to suit the kind of message that you are catering to your audience. Here's a quick exercise for you now that we have understood what makes the right data and why intent matters in choosing your data. Choose a topic. It could be water use, mobile banking, student attendance, anything. Choose a topic and write down two different stories that you could tell using different kinds of data. We have seen how the same topic can be seen through different lenses. So, try to choose a topic that covers multiple lenses and see what different kinds of data can do to cater different kinds of stories. Now that we have dealt with the first half of today's lecture title, The Right Data, let us now come to the right story. I want to approach this topic, how to tell the right story, based on our established foundations about audience analysis. We have already learned about the preferences of technical and non technical audiences. So let us build our understanding of what is the right story to tell on our already established knowledge of audience analysis. So we will look at again these two different kinds of audiences and we will see what are their story preferences. How do we approach these storytelling preferences? Number one, let's begin with technical audience. Technical audience, if you remember, are our own peers within the technical space. Data scientists, analysts, engineers, maybe even policy researchers. All of them are your technical audience because they would understand the jargon and the technical nuances that you bring to the table. What they prefer in terms of data stories? They prefer precision and granularity because that is their own area of interest. That is where their own stake is laid out in the entire process. They also prefer methodological transparency, as in how the data was cleaned, what is the sample size, what are the models that are used. They also prefer statistical depth. Any error bars, any p values, any confidence intervals, all of these they would be most concerned with. And they are the audience that can digest complex visualizations. So if you cater them multi-axis graphs, if you cater them scatter plots, histograms, they are okay with it because they can read through them and they can make sense out of them. That is why these are the preferences that we as technical communicators often feel the most at home with, because this is the level of complexity at which you and I might be thinking, and this is also the level of complexity at which they will be comfortable receiving the information. So let's look at the storytelling style. When we want to appeal to a technical audience, how will we tell our story? Number one, you emphasize on objectivity and reproducibility. We have talked about this in our second module on audience analysis, that whenever a technical audience approaches any kind of documentation, they would first look for how objective the document is and whether the entire data algorithm or the data model is reproducible. Meaning, have you defined it and described it to its absolute granular detail so that they can test it for themselves for its validity and reliability? Also, when you are talking to the technical audience, keep your data first, then come to the conclusion. Don't begin with a conclusion because they might start confusing itself with something that is a done deal. They want to focus on data first, so begin your story with the data first and then reach the conclusion. We have spoken about this in that chapter about audience analysis, that there is a certain structure that works in terms of technical audience. If you remember, I called it the IMRAD structure. So the technical audience will respond really well to an IMRAD structure: introduction, methods, results, and discussions. This is the structure of a technical report for the technical audience. Let's see a use case of how we tell a story to a technical audience. If you are telling a story about COVID-19 vaccination rates by district, this is how you will cater it to the technical audience. Let's look at what the technical audience wants. The technical audience obviously would look at sample size and data collection methods. They would also look at comparison across models and metrics. For example, was a logistical regression used versus a decision tree being used? And they would prefer longitudinal data. What do we mean by that? Longitudinal data means data that is collected repeatedly over time from the same subjects. So when you are catering a data story to a technical audience about COVID-19 vaccination rates by district, these are the structures that can help you tell the right story to your intended audience. Now that we have established our understanding of technical audience storytelling, let's move on to the non-technical audience. If you remember from our second module, non-technical audience are executives, general public, clients, community groups, policymakers, media professionals, marketing professionals, so on and so forth. Anybody who may not belong to the technical peer group, who may not understand the jargon with which you have done your analysis, and who may not so much be interested in the mechanics of the analysis, but the implementation of it. That is the non-technical audience group. Let's see what they prefer. They prefer simplicity and relevance. They prefer clear, memorable takeaways. In fact, they prefer a visual kind of storytelling. So any infographics, any maps, any pie or bar charts, that is their playground. That is where they would thrive the best in understanding the information. And in the end, they prefer focusing on the impact over the process. So how do we cater our storytelling style? We keep it human-centered, meaning we create characters. We keep it human-centered, we have an intuitive logic, we have an arc that follows the story. Human-centered means you will need to create characters. Intuitive logic means you will need to create an arc. It has to be conclusion first, meaning you will have to open with the larger impact that the story has made and then go into supporting data. Because the non-technical audience will quickly glimpse the results, and then if they want to check, they will move on to the supporting data. A story being told to a non-technical audience is often driven by a single clear insight. They don't actually deal very well with complicated insights, interlinked narratives emerging from data. So the onus lies on you, my dear data communicator, to simplify and clarify the insight emerging from your analysis. Let's see a sample use case. If you see the same vaccination rate story for a general public, this is what the non-technical audience would want. They would want the key takeaway, as in only 60% of rural districts meet the target. That is the key takeaway from the analysis that you have done. Instead of complicated visual mediums, they would prefer a simple chart showing the urban versus rural gap, something that can be intuitively understood. Maybe one quote or story from a frontline worker, somebody who's been there, somebody who has seen things from their own eyes. Learning about their eyewitness account will create an emotional resonance with the story, and that is what will work for a non-technical audience. All in all, use this three-part approach to select the data that fits your story. First, think about the message. What are you trying to say? Let's say, for example, that you are trying to say access to clean energy is increasing. So now the second step is think about the audience. Who needs to understand this message? Let's say, for example, continuing from our first point, a local government team deciding where to install solar panels. So now, based on these 2 points of data, let's move on to the third step. What is the right data? What will connect with them? So if it is a local government team and you want to communicate the first statement, maps showing solar installations by village combined with cost savings per household. This right here is the right data that will connect the audience with the message. That critical decision will ensure that your insight turns into an actionable step and actually leaves the impact that you were intending with the story that you're telling. After summarizing the entire thought process of choosing the right data, let me now talk about choosing the story angle based on the audience that you have in front of you. For example, if you have to ask questions to decide what story angle you will have to take based on the technicality or the non-technicality of the audience, these are some questions that can help you. Ask yourself, what is the desired action from the audience? What is the outcome that you want them to take? This is also an angle about persuasion. What do you want them to do once they have engaged with the story that you have written? What decisions does the data need to support? This is about reverse engineering. If you see there is a decision being made at the end of the story, and you will need to see what kind of data you have selected and what kind of decision emerges from it. So, in the end, you can put yourself in the shoes of your reader and see what decisions are they likely to take based on the data that you have provided them. Next, what is the level of statistical literacy among your audience? I believe we have discussed this in quite some detail during our audience analysis chapter, that depending on their statistical literacy, depending on their comfort with the jargon, you will be able to select what kind of language to use, what kind of tone to use, and examples that will be relevant. And in the end, what format will the story take? Will it be an email? Will it be a report? Will it be a blog post, dashboard, executive memo, public infographic, so on and so forth? If you remember, in the audience analysis chapter, we discussed one quote by Marshall McLuhan: the medium is the message. That is quite relevant, in fact, in this case, because in the end, your audience will gravitate towards the format that you will cater to them. That is why choosing the right medium for your audience makes a lot of difference, goes a very long way in deciding what kind of audience will gravitate towards your written work. After having understood all of this in excruciating detail, let us now arrive at the last exercise for the day. Choose a data set that you have. It could be real or it could be imagined. How would you change your data choice and framing for a professor versus a municipal leader? These two are a technical and a non-technical audience. I hope that that much is clear to you by now. Try to think about how would you frame a story based on the setting, context, characters, conflicts, arcs, everything we have studied so far. How will you frame the data to suit a technical audience storytelling versus a non-technical audience storytelling? At the end of today's lecture, I would like to reiterate that audience analysis is as important as data analysis. We have dedicated enough of our intellectual pursuit to establish our understanding on audience analysis. So we understand that catering to the right message, catering to the right people makes the world of a difference in our communication. The best data storytellers adjust not just the story, but the lens, as in the perspective through which the story is being told. Earlier in today's class, we saw three examples arising from the same data, from the same topic, three different lenses through which to look at the story, and three different stories that can emerge. And the right data is not the most complex data, it is the most meaningful to your audience. And as the audience changes, the meaningfulness of the data will also change. I hope that we have equipped ourselves to accommodate that change in real time and as it is expected out of us in any given moment. That was it from my side for this lecture. We were discussing the art and the craft of choosing the right data for the right story. We looked at what do we mean by right data, what are its qualifying factors, and also how do we tell the right story depending on the audience that we are catering. All of these will help us synthesize the learning that we have had so far and channelize it in the right direction. The next class, we are going to look at 3 different techniques of storytelling, and I will not reveal what they are right now. Come to the next class and find out for yourself. 3 different unique techniques for storytelling that will help you make all of this learning practical and implementable in the very moment where it is required. Until then, all the best, keep learning, stay curious, and I will see you in the next class. Thank you so much for joining me today. Namaskar.